Hello everyone, welcome to this first lecture in Unit 3 in our series on political science online. This is the first of 3 lectures that, if you guys remember towards the beginning of the class, you guys all selected from our list. Because of that, I hope that these are going to be interesting, and I pardon for the delay in getting these up. Bear in mind that I had to make these lectures from scratch based on your feedback. So I hope you'll bear with me, and I hope you enjoy these lectures. I really worked hard on them, so I hope that you guys will find something in here that is interesting. Now, Unit 3 is going to work a little bit different than Unit 1 and 2, in that, unlike the first 2 units, for Unit 3, while you watch all 3 lectures, you will be evaluated in the form of a paper only on one of these lectures. So listen to all 3, look through them, find one that you like, and that's the one that you're going to be working, doing a paper for. That is coming very shortly. There will be an announcement on that, I hope, by tomorrow night. However, just so that you guys are all aware of that, ideally, I planned this out so that you guys could have in Unit 3 a paper on something that you would be interested in, as opposed to something that you are being forced to write about. And so by giving you both the input at the start of the class and a choice now on what you're writing about, hopefully you'll find something that you find interesting, or that at least you can get through writing without hating your life. Because I think if you've written papers before, you can attest to this. Writing a paper on something you don't care about is a bit of an awful experience, both for you guys to write and then for me to read, because they don't come out well. So I hope this is something that you guys will be interested in. This first lecture is going to be on Putin's Russia, and specifically we're going to look at what Putin wants, why his behavior is so aberrant compared to maybe other powers in the world, and of course, how we deal with the fallout of certain aspects of Putin's behavior in recent years. So I think you'll find this one interesting. And shoot me a message if you have any questions on this. Without further ado, let's get started. So there are 4 big questions that we have to answer when trying to figure out Russia's history. The first one is sort of basic. How does Russia's history affect its behavior? Because you're not really going to understand a lot of where Russia is right now without understanding where it has been and how it got to now. I think secondly, you want to figure out what Vladimir Putin thinks of the world, how he views the world, how he views Russia's place in that world. Thirdly, we want to understand what Vladimir Putin's goals are and how he goes about achieving them. Now, that's not the same as a world viewpoint, but rather this is specifically what Putin wants and how he goes about getting it. And the last part, and this is more of a rhetorical question and a question that hopefully by the end of this lecture you'll have some thoughts about. What are some solutions that policymakers can use to solve the issue, if at all? Maybe there is no solution. Maybe we shouldn't have a solution. I look forward to hearing your feedback on that. So let's talk about modern Russia. As you guys, I'm sure, are aware, Russia spends a vast majority of the 20th century as the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, formed in 1919, was essentially was the textbook communist state. But it doesn't work. It did not work the way communist states in other countries that still exist today, like, for example, North Korea or China operated. Russia was far more focused on industrialization. Bear in mind that going into the 20th century, before the revolution, Russia was a de facto feudal state, a sort of medieval country that was still a holdover from the way things used to work in Europe way back in the 14 and 1500s. And sure, they had some modern ideas, but at the end of the day, the structure of society had not evolved and had not adapted to new ideas coming out of not only Smith and Marx, but even people like Hobbes and Locke. So because of that, Russia, after the revolution, finds itself having to rapidly industrialize just to keep up with the modern powers that surrounded it, both Germany, Japan, and the United States. And it does so. And it does so, arguably through great sacrifice and great human tragedy under the rulerships of both Lenin and Stalin. But eventually, Russia gets to the point where it can go toe to toe with the major players on the world stage. And if you think about it, the only thing comparable has actually been the rise of China. Russia goes from a backwater in Europe to nuclear superpower in 40 years. That's incredible. That's unprecedented. And that just goes to show how rapidly the country develops and industrializes under the communists. And don't take that to be an endorsement of that. Quite a few people died trying to drag Russia into the 20th century. It was not at all a peaceful and happy process. But by the end of it, Russia gets to be one of the major global contenders of the world. Now, this is a problem in that at the end of the war, at the end of the Cold War, Russia, for many reasons, cultural, economic, social, almost decides to unilaterally disarm. That at the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the attempted coup in what is now Russia, if the Cold War is a game, Russia decides to stop playing. And in so doing, it gives up a lot of territory in the geopolitical sense that Putin, as we're going to see in a minute, views as historically part of the Russian sphere of influence. And we're going to look at both geopolitics and sphere of influences in a minute, because those are really fascinating terms that are really central to the Russian understanding of how the world works. And it's a little different to what we actually looked at in Unit 2. It's a combination of quite a few different things that we've looked at. But Putin views this abandonment of territory, and you can see this in the map that's on the slide right now. So in the corner you can see all the countries that were part of the former USSR, and they're the only ones highlighted with the various colors on the big map. All of these were part of the former Soviet Union in some way, shape, or form. They were part of the Soviet bloc, and eventually they leave. They all are allowed, in Putin's mind at least, to leave the Soviet Union. And only 2 years later, Boris Yeltsin becomes the president of a new country, Russia, that forms from the ashes of the Soviet Union. But this does not mean that Russia in the 90s suddenly develops and becomes a prosperous nation. Quite the opposite. Russia in the 90s is a period of rapid corruption and the mass sale of every aspect of the Russian government, from military assets to extractive resources like oil and gas to telecommunications. And there's videos in the playlist that really chart the rise of Russia's oligarchs who got tremendously rich by purchasing these on the cheap. But this rapid transition from communism to capitalism is known by Western economists as shock therapy. The idea being, well, this is going to be painful anyway, so let's pull off the Band-Aid, quote unquote, as quickly as possible and make this work. However, by the 1990s, the Russian economy is stagnant in a free fall. And one good metric to see this is actually in Russian male life expectancy, which plummets by a decade during the early 90s. as people can't find work, as people can't find food, as the rate of childhood mortality skyrockets. This is a bad period in Russian history. And here's another example. So this is a graph. I'll explain this to you guys just so that you guys can make sense of this. That charts the economy in Russia as compared to Russia and Germany in the Great Depression, and a similar country also experiencing a sort of post-Soviet economy in Poland. And you can see how eventually both Poland and Germany and then the United States all see recovery a couple of years into the recession. But Russia continues to go on a free fall. This straight line just plummets. And eventually, by the year 2000, Yeltsin abdicates, for lack of a better word, citing poor health, and a young, ambitious politician, he's the mayor of St. Petersburg, Vladimir Putin, becomes the new premier of Russia. And he does so by banking on the support of Russia's oligarchs. And his campaign is really predicated on recapturing the glory of the lost glory of the Russian state. This sort of perceived sense of global importance that Russia had during the period of the Cold War. This idea that Russia had an outsized role in global politics. There is a big preoccupation, even during the period of the Cold War, for Russia to be seen as a major power, as a major player in global affairs. And, to some extent it is. But Russia's economy is nowhere near that of, for example, the United States or China. And so, even though it insists on being on that level, it really has no basis to other than this perception of we used to be this global superpower and we want to be there again. So Russia's complex history affects its current behavior for all the reasons that we just saw. Now, a big part of Vladimir Putin's view of the world is actually influenced a lot by its history. There's this idea, and I'm sure I'm going to be butchering this in Vladimir Putin's viewpoint, called derzavnost. And it's this idea that Russia has a destiny to be a global great power, a derzava, exerting its influence all over the world. Putin is said to have highlighted this policy all the way back into the late 90s. So even before he was elected to be the premier in Russia. In fact, in the Rand Corporation's view of how Russia interprets the world, they argue that Russian foreign policy is heavily influenced by perceptions of threat and vulnerability. In fact, Russia's geography, namely its lack of major natural boundaries, and its history of foreign invasion have contributed to a national discourse of vulnerability and concern about foreign threat. So essentially, the argument is Russia both has aspirations to be a great power and yet also simultaneously has fears that if it loses its current position in the world, that it may face a threat from abroad. It has this perception of threat and vulnerability about itself, which is almost hypocritical given how much they aspire to be a global power. But this also explains the term that we used before, geopolitics. Russian political identity is predicated on geopolitics. And geopolitics is the study of geography, of boundaries, but only through the lens of politics of international relations. You study global territory not in as much as who lives there and why and what its natural features are, but rather the cold, calculating logic of political interest and international relations. this territory belongs to this country, this territory falls to this country, but it belongs to this sphere of influence. In fact, another big Russian scholar, Stephen Kotkin, argues that Russia views small countries on its borders not as potential friends, but as potential beachheads for enemies. There are ways through which they can protect themselves from invasion. Putin views all nominally independent borderland states, now including Ukraine, as weapons in the hand of Western powers intent on wielding them against Russia. Russia views any encroachment on its neighbors as an encroachment on its own national territory. Now you may be asking, what does this have to do with anything? Well, as we're going to see in a minute, when we look at Vladimir Putin's foreign policy goals, let's sort of put Russia's viewpoint into a theory. And we're going to try to understand Russia's behavior based on all the facts that we've given. Now, to be clear, Putinism is a term that I made up. It doesn't exist. Please don't use it in your papers. But it's an interesting thought experiment in trying to understand what Russia views the world as. And so here's some things. It combines an almost excessive emphasis on geopolitics with a study of its neighbors. All countries, especially its neighboring countries, are not allies in the system. They are threats. They are ways through which the world can get to Russia. And so they should be controlled as much as possible to protect from invasion. The major metric to analyze power for Vladimir Putin is influence. And we're going to look at spheres of influence in a minute. Because these spheres of influence indicate areas where a country has enough diplomatic, cultural, historical, military, or even just a normative presence to affect policy. So let me give you an example. Let's say Canada would like to do something that may affect the United States in a certain way. While Canadians, and with all due respect to my Canadian friends, may believe that they can do so without the knowledge and consent of the United States, they still pick up the phone, and clear it with Washington. This is because, they may say, oh, it's about being a good neighbor. But in Vladimir Putin's world, this is a almost required act for countries on Russia's border. This is a required act as part of being in Russia's sphere of influence. Russia can influence policy in its neighboring countries. That's what it defines as influence. And so, if you live in a world like that, organizations like NATO and systems of alliances, NATO, the EU, the WTO, all of these big international institutions only exist to expand the influence of countries that control them, say the United States and Germany. And countries should approach sort of these breaches of their sphere of influences just as harshly as they would view breaches of their national sovereignty, as breaches of their own borders. And they should respond accordingly, even if that response means a military action. See the Ukraine. Now, what does that have to do with anything? Well, bear in mind that both NATO and the EU have been consistently expanding into Eastern Europe. Poland is now part of the EU. Romania, Bulgaria, all of these former Soviet countries are becoming closer to the West and joining Western institutions. And Putin views this as an attack on Russia's borders, even though Russia's borders are nowhere near where the action takes place, because Russia views these areas as part of its sphere of influence. And so if we wanted to turn this into sort of a theory that we would be familiar with, Putinism combines the zero-sum nature and the hegemony model that we saw in neorealism, but also the soft power approach and the focus on institutions that we saw in neoliberalism, but not for the reasons that neoliberals do. They also have some emphasis on the core semi-periphery and periphery model that we see in neo-Marxism, but importantly, they also focus on influence and normative power, and they get that from constructivism. Putinists, again, this is a term that I made up, it doesn't exist, really focuses on these elements of the theories that we've looked at so far. And so, let's have a look at these sphere of influences. So, this is a graph that was in the Rand Corporation's document, and I highly recommend that you give that a read because it is fascinating if you are at all curious about this issue. They talk about the term near abroad. And these are countries that Russia wants to have the most direct influence in for a wide variety of reasons. And here is the near abroad represented on a graph. These are all countries that Russia would like to be aspirationally part of its sphere of influence. And Russia sort of justifies this by invoking really a policy of Ruski Mir, the Russian world. And as the Rand Corporation says, the reach of the concept of the Ruski Mir may actually be quite broad, and the identification of shared links and connections may be politicized and adapted based on other Russian foreign policy goals. What he's saying here is essentially that the concept of Ruski Mir, Russian world, is so broad and so vague that Putin can really shift and adapt what it means based on what he's looking to do. So he can, influence elections in Belarus under the concept of Ruski Mir and intervene militarily in Ukraine based on the concept of Ruski Mir. And all of these countries listed on the graph, according to Vladimir Putin, belong to the Russian world. These former Soviet or former communist countries that in Putin's world should be a direct part of Russia's sphere of influence. Practically, what does this mean? Putin, defines influence, therefore, in three ways. Number one, countries should not make any important foreign policy or security policy decisions without first consulting Russia. Number two, when Russia calls, you pick up the phone. That's something that Russia absolutely requires. And, importantly, ensuring that foreign leaders, especially leaders in its near abroad, follow through with requests that Russia makes. And lastly, joining Russian-backed organizations. And lastly, as I was saying, sorry, my phone went off, Russia really requires that countries in its sphere of influence participate in its own equivalent versions of things like NATO and the EU, Russian non-governmental organizations, all of whom have significant ties to Russia. And it also, therefore, sees NATO and the EU expanding into Eastern Europe, and simultaneously the rise of China and its influence in Central Asia as being a direct threat to this model. So the example that I give in the slide is the example of Romania. Romania is a former Soviet country that is now a newer member of both the EU and NATO. And because it has the backing of both the EU and NATO, it doesn't necessarily need to consult with Russia, or doesn't need to follow through with Russian requests, because it is both backed and defended by these institutions. It does not need to concern itself with the opinion of Russia as Romania goes about doing its own business. And Russia views this and countries that have the same mentality as Romania as a direct attack on the Russian sphere of influence. In fact, Russia's official documents emphasize the growing threat from NATO. And thus, the argument is that if NATO pursues the further integration of former Soviet countries, Russian officials will likely continue to perceive NATO as aggression. Vladimir Putin in 2014, during the Ukraine crisis, mentioned that the West must have lacked political instinct and common sense to not foresee the consequences of their action. Russia found itself in a position it could not retreat from. And if you compress the spring all the way to its limit, it will snap back hard. Now, I do not say this to justify Vladimir Putin. Quite the opposite. But it is an explanation for how someone like Putin views the world. For Putin, the expansion of these institutions represent grave threats. And anything he can do to damage significant countries in these institutions or the institution themselves are therefore considered to be beneficial to Russia and Russia's foreign policy goals. So this takes us to the last question. What are solutions that policymakers can take to solve this problem? And as this map will see, Russian influence campaigns and Russian-backed acts of things like hacking have happened all over predominant either EU countries or, as we are now seeing, countries in the former Soviet Union that dare break away to join either China or the EU. You saw this in the Ukraine. You are seeing this in countries like Georgia and Azerbaijan. And all of these countries are seeing a profound attack backed by Russia on their institutions. And this, of course, has crossed the Atlantic with influence campaigns happening in both Canada and the United States. And in fact, if we start to look at these influence campaigns, we actually see that they involve three different kinds. The first is what we would call direct action. And direct action is quite literally action undertaken by the Russian security apparatus to either intimidate or directly influence policy. So things like military intervention, like we saw in Ukraine, but also war games that it plays on the border with countries to intimidate them. You can see support for rebel groups within those countries. Political assassination, as is what has been going on in the UK, and of course economic and resource sanctions, particularly from their oil and gas sector. So it is particularly crippling for a country to have things like, for example, their natural gas supplier stop selling them natural gas in the middle of winter. These are certain things that Russia can do to directly influence behavior in its neighbors. But also election interference. And this is done to get either favorable policy outcomes in things like referendums or to get governments whose interests or ideologies align closely with those in Russia. The last one is cyber warfare. And there's different kinds of cyber attack and cyber warfare that can be done, but the vast majority is done with the idea to intimidate, scare, or sway public opinion into backing Russian policy goals, Russian interests, or to back away from Western goals. And so the question I want to leave you off with is, what can we do? And this is a question that hopefully you guys will be able to answer in your papers. And if you have any questions, please let me know. You guys know how to reach me. I hope you found this lecture interesting, and I will catch you in the next lecture. Bye-bye.